in Sydney. Now, just before the break, we were talking about some of you who felt that to pop your heads up and say that you were climate change skeptics or skeptics about man-made climate change led to you feeling ostracised. Stephen, I said I'd give you a chance to respond to that. Do you think that that is a problem in this debate, that people are finding that, you know, there's a kind of political correctness one way or the other about what you should believe rather than having a genuine debate?
I actually hate that when it happens, and I'm very sympathetic with what happened to you, because I can assure you I get death threat emails all the time, and I know exactly what it feels like to get these kinds of things. In fact, I decry the destruction in civility that's been happening around this issue and in the U.S. over issues like health care and creation, teaching in schools, and things like that. Because if people can't maintain a civil dialogue, how are you going to run a civil democracy? And I mean, I get stuff like, you communistic dupe of the United Nations, you want to create a world government that's going to take away our religious and economic freedom. You're a traitor, you should be hung. I have dozens of such emails. That's not fun. And my son got one today like that, and he called and told me that. So this is not the way.
Your son got one today?
Yes, not quite as bad as this, but how could you tolerate living with your father, this kind of stuff. We get that kind of stuff. There's no place for that in civil society, because scientists also need to be engaged by helping people understand risk. And when you're in this constant set of combat, then how do we have any chance of talking to each other in a civil way, which is why I agreed to do this program.
Katie?
I was just about to say thank you for actually engaging in dialogue sensibly and not demonising anyone who dares to raise a doubt.
Okay, you used to be a believer in man-made climate change.
No.
To some extent?
I was never quite sure, to be honest. I don't know enough. The problem is, from my point of view, that we've had, I suppose, the case for the prosecution in legal terms. You know, this is how, worst case scenario. It's really hard to stand up and say, okay, I'm going to knock that down in this present climate. It's, excuse the pun, but yeah, it's really hard to stand up and go, okay, I'm a scientist who is going to try and disprove this.
I'm interested, though, in this question of trust, because it's come up with a lot of people here about how much they trust the data, how much they trust the scientists. You don't trust scientists, Chris. Why?
Well, it was very interesting hearing you talk just a moment about how scientists like the median, a moderate tendency. What I find suspicious is that I have not heard, and I watch a lot of media, one of these moderately minded scientists come out and hose down the doomsday scenarios being peddled by environmentalists and our politicians. I'm not speaking of you yourself, sir, but your industry, your lobby, the lobby of which you are a part, including a lot of people I'm sure you have arguments with, are actually saying X plus Y all the way to we have to chuck out industrialisation.
So they're being absolute and certain, yes. And you want them to be less certain.
I would like to hear people in your business admit some doubt.
I don't know any IPCC scientist who has ever said we should chuck industrial civilization. Well, that's a straw man. Where'd you get that?
I have never heard one of them stand up and say this politician should choose their words more carefully because it is not that disastrous, that this environmentalist should be more moderate in their language because they're being extreme. I have not heard one IPCC scientist say that.
Please read my book. You'll see where I've been doing this for 40 years. And I'm not alone in doing that. I think it would be irresponsible for us to leave out better cases, and it would also be irresponsible to leave out worse cases. It is not a scientist's job to judge whether or not the risks are sufficient to hedge against any of these possibilities. It's only our job to report risk. And that's why we have so many rounds of reviews. I was talking about, when I said scientists gravitate to the middle, I was talking about most IPCC scientists. They're not typically very articulate, and they're not the ones you're seeing on the media very often.
You were very quick to comment on what you called biased language earlier. I think a scientist in your position could speak up against biased language, even in areas where it actually contributes to your industry.
It's an interesting point, Stephen. It is an interesting point that the scientists could enter the debate once it becomes politicised and perhaps distorted in that politicisation. The scientists could pop their heads up more and say, hang on a minute, you know, what we do know is this, what we don't know is this.
I can speak for myself, that's exactly what I do. But I can also tell you, and so do most of the colleagues that I respect. Not everybody. There are people who understate and there are people who overstate. The other problem is, don't forget the media filter. Media gets end of the world versus good for you boxed extremes, like it's a trial. You know, we've got guilt and we have innocence, and they will set that frame. So if a scientist is speaking in a bell curve, right, and you allow some probability of a really nasty outcome and some probability of beneficial outcomes, and every speech I give, if you go on YouTube, you'll find them, you'll see I do this. I have no control about the fact that because I have concern about the more serious scenarios, and I do, I don't want us to fall into that trap. I don't take 10% risks with planetary life support system. That's my personal view. That's my personal values, and I always say that. The point, though, is if it's then reported that I believe that it's certain that it's going to be in the worst case, that's a misframing of what I've said. Just as when I'm arguing with other people who are more conservative and they allow a small probability that they think I'm right, and they have a larger probability that things are milder, and then they get boxed into the frame that they only think that it's mild, that's not fair to them either. It's because when you go through the filter of this kind of advocacy, end of the world and good for you, which in every speech, again, go look it up on YouTube, you'll see me, I say the 2 lowest probability outcomes. That's a very bad way to convey the nature of meaning, because all it can do is confuse people and create the polarization that's led those of you who've gotten the hate mails from getting them, because people get locked in those polarizations.
Jessica, why are you a climate skeptic?
Oh, look, Stephen, I think there is just, it is such a complex issue, and I agree that the soundbite journalism is a problem. So my question to you, I have 2 questions. First one is, for those of us who are keen to get past those 5-second grabs that we see on the evening news, but are not scientists, are just the everyman, can you give us a couple of sources of good information that make it very easy to understand what is obviously a complex issue? And then my second question is, knowing what you know, are you afraid?
Okay, very good questions. There are many good websites. There's absolutely no such thing as a perfect site. I get very nervous about elliptical blogs, those which are so polarized into one or the other, because generally they're very good writers, and if somebody already pre-believes them, they're very exciting. But then what, again, we lose is a civil dialogue. You can read Environmental Protection Agency things. You can go to universities. There are a lot of things. I would argue, some of you may smile, that one of the most credible sets of information is to read the IPCC reports. They drip with caveats. In fact, they're darn hard to read because they're not very well written. But there are a lot of people who do it. Private books that are not peer-reviewed are much more likely to be elliptical, and blogs. So there are plenty of websites out there.
We do have to wrap up. How many people here have shifted ground at all tonight? Has anyone shifted their ground? Oh, one hand up over here. Yes. One up there. Why?
I was sitting on the fence, and really there's just been so much technical jargon from both sides, and so much almost hatred towards each other. I was hoping to get more information for me to make up my own mind. And I feel more information, and quite simply the one that was a gallon of water in and a gallon of water out, but everyone seemed to agree there was this 3% that was man-made, and that had to go somewhere. And as simplified as that was, I feel as though man has impacted.
David, what about you?
The doctor, you've put some great arguments forward, and my question is that we've got two sides of the story, and yes, you get your media bites, but I think as skeptics, as laymen, as normal members of the public, there's enough information out there for us to seek if we wish to seek it. What makes us believe you over the man that stands next to you? Now, we don't have a scientist from the other side because it would have been probably impossible to run the show.
Well, there's a whole audience of people from the other side.
And we got that sort of argy-bargy sort of thing. How do we believe you over the others when both argue with credible points? You both have excellent information there, and it makes it difficult.
Very good question. I teach a seminar for freshmen and sophomores called Environmental Literacy. And how can you discern the quality of an argument? Watch out for the myth-busters and the truth-tellers. Anybody who's got the answer almost certainly is not credible on a complicated problem. Who's talking in ranges and bell curves and wheels of fortune? Yes, that's self-serving. I am. And that's because that's the nature of our scientific understanding. So is IPCC. So I think the best guide for you is when there's a complex problem, remember you can break it down into well-established bits where we do have some things that are very likely, competing explanations, like Greenland is melting, but exactly why, we don't know why. And speculative, we really don't know. What's the cloud feedback amount going to be? And when people talk like that, they're much more likely to be credible when they tell you that they have, the smoking gun that proves or disproves. Very rarely in complex science is that true.
Jessica, are you still wanting your question answered?
I think it might just be a good way to simplify all the jargon and to put it in a perspective that everybody can understand. Knowing what you know and having studied this for, as you say, 40 years, are you afraid? Are you afraid for your grandchildren?
Well, of course, that's a personal judgment about what. I'm afraid that we have a very uncomfortable probability, which to me is more than 10%, of some pretty nasty outcomes. We also have, 10, 20% chance that there won't be very many nasty outcomes and everything else sort of in between. I'm more worried about what the US Pentagon officials said, which is that climate change is not the cause of security threats, but it's a threat multiplier, because you don't want to sit there in already stressed areas and then add stress. I worry more about that than I do about most other aspects of climate. If we raise the sea level many meters, yeah, we're going to move billions of people and trillions of dollars, but that's replaceable. I'm more worried about species extinction because that's irreversible. When if you warm up, you drive them off the tops of mountains. But I also worry about badly implemented climate policy. Again, go read my book or go look at any of my YouTubes, and you will find out that I always point out you can't just impose a cost on energy overnight, although we have to eventually do that. You have to have a polluter pays principle, in my opinion, because for me, it affects the quality of my Pinot Noir. For a poor person, it might affect the quality of their protein. But I do not want to hold the sustainability agenda of the planet hostage to that. We should not subsidize poverty by artificially low prices of commodities like food or energy. Let's get the price to include all the costs, but we do have to have side payments to help those people through a transition. And I mean, I don't know any coal miner or any auto worker making a big car who does it to screw up the climate, but they may be screwing up the climate. We've argued that. But if so, that may not be allowed to be continued very long. But you can't just hang them out to dry. You've got to do something. So I would be afraid of either having those groups disadvantaged by policy, just as I'm afraid that the small island states will have to move and lose their homelands because they're disadvantaged by sea level level rise. And we therefore in the planet will have to deal not just with the magnitude of the climate change, and it's not just the consequences of that, but also the consequences of the policies. And they involve not just preventing climate change, but dealing with people who are affected by those policies. That's part of the complexity, which is so difficult to manage in a world of a bunch of nation states where people can't agree.
Okay, we have to wrap it up, but we can keep going online. So even though we've run out of time here, hop online if you want to continue the discussion. I know there are a lot of things that we haven't got to tonight. Stephen Schneider, thank you very much for your time tonight. And my thanks very much to our audience of skeptics. A few of you seem